My opinion on AM. You cheated not only the game, but yourself. You didn't grow, you didn't improve, you took a shortcut and gained nothing. You experienced a hollow victory. Nothing was risked, and nothing was gained. It's sad that you don't know the difference. Now, obviously, that's a meme post. Many of you probably even recognize this copypasta. However, it is impossible to deny that automarkers are very prevalent in the Party Finder Ultimate scene these days, and people are very opinionated about that fact. Like, people are so opinionated about this that when Sindelf posted this very copypasta on Twitter, someone replied with a modified version complaining about how much people are focused on the fact that AM is so common, rather than working to make people less reliant on it. And personally, I think this is worthy of a longer discussion. So, today I want to go over all the places where people use the dreaded Allegan melons, alternative ways to solve these mechanics, and even make some suggestions for the devs that would help people to feel less that they need such a tool to clear this content with groups of random, unorganized people. First, I want to be clear about a few things though. For starters, I am someone who has cleared every ultimate without the use of automarkers. Especially in an organized group, it is entirely reasonable to clear all of these fights 100% legitimately. I have also done clears of nearly every ultimate in Party Finder where automarkers were in use. I do not have that program or any of those add-ons or whatever myself. I wouldn't risk it because it is against TOS, but I also can't control what other players do, and I alone do not have the power to correct the entire culture of at least Aether's Party Finder. Still, I think we would be better off as a community if they weren't so commonly used, particularly in situations like my first example. The Thunders in the second phase of UCOB. Honestly, there's no real justification for this. The whole phase is a focus check based around you spending half the time staring at the party list and looking at debuffs anyway. The way these Thunders work fits into that design, and considering the way you handle them is for those two people to just run out, all they need to do is look at the other person running out and not be close to them. Anyone who can clear UCOB can do this mechanic without automarkers. Now, do they make the mechanic easier? Absolutely. And hey, I've definitely had some off nights myself where being able to see over a person's head if they were the lightning was definitely appreciated. But we don't really need it. And I honestly believe this one only exists because the melons have become so common in the other ultimates that people just said fuck it and looked for any place that could be even slightly helpful in any of the ultimates. So, now let's look at what I'd say is the real origin point of the problem. The AM Granddaddy, Titan Jails in Uwu. 3 people get selected for jails and have to line up in a specific way so they chain explosions to put a puddle under Titan to awaken him. And because you're not given a lot of time to sort out who will be which link in that chain, people use automarkers to determine it for them. Funny enough, there's a very simple alternative to this, and most players doing ultimates in Party Finder know what it is. I present to you the conga line. All you need is for people to fan out as they run away from that last bomb, and you can read left to right as the front to back priority for the jails. And since people are spread, you can instantly identify who those people are. Oh, but they made the landslides weird. Adjust. You're in an ultimate. You can do it. Alternatively, and I don't like this idea as much, but you can always use the sack strat. Kill half the party on the knockback or whatever, leave the man tank and 3 others alive, and there's no longer any randomness to the mechanic. Just don't make me be one of the sacrifices, please. Now, with this being the first instance of the melons really being prominent, you might expect me to be lambasting the devs and telling them how they could have avoided this. But honestly, I think they did just about everything right here. They don't make you look at the party list during this fast-paced positioning mechanic. No, they give you a visual indicator on your character, so you have all the info you need looking around the arena. The only way I think they could really improve it is by maybe putting the markers on people slightly earlier, or by taking advantage of a certain quirk in how the jails work. Because apparently, and don't quote me on this, this is regurgitated info from quite a while ago, but apparently only 2 of these jails originate from Titan himself. For some reason, the 3rd jail supposedly comes from Garuda. And if they did something to make that specific jail distinct, maybe make the marker green or something instead of the yellow, the community could easily decide on a specific place for the green jail to stand, and then leave it to the other 2 people to pick their spots around it, which is going to be a lot more manageable than a 3-person adjustment. I do think that it would look weird. I don't know if I'd really recommend it, but if SE wanted to do something to thoroughly eliminate the community's need for AM, that would be a big step towards doing it in this encounter. Now, interestingly, as far as I'm aware, there aren't any prevalent automarkers for T. Alexander enjoyers stay winning, I guess. I did hear at one point about people using them for wormholes so they can continue seeing the numbers that were over their head at the start of the mechanic throughout? But remembering your number has always been the easiest part of that mechanic anyway, so I honestly don't understand how that even helps. Ironically, T is also the only ultimate that I haven't really done in PF at all, so I could be missing something here, but if I'm not, hey, shout out to T for just conveying all of its information properly to begin with and avoiding this nonsense. My favorite fight in the game has been less fortunate on this front. DSR has 2 common spots where AM is used, one during Wrath of the Heavens and the other during Wrath Flames. The one during Wrath of the Heavens is literally just the nail situation again. Honestly, that whole mechanic is basically just UCOB condensed into a single 30-second trio, but thankfully that makes my job easy here, as the same arguments apply. Well, mostly. Unlike Nail Phase, this trio is centered more around markers that you see on people's character models and adjusting to those rather than looking at the debuff bar. But since people are so spread out during this, it's much easier to see who initially gets the animation for the lightning debuff being applied, and the lightnings make it obvious who they are while they're moving, as long as they are making sure that they're not running through where the rest of the party is going to be stacked. So it's very easy to spot who these people are without any changes. Basically, while the surrounding situation is different, these lightnings are fine just like they were in UCOB, and I don't think the player base or the devs need to make any changes here. Just do the mechanic. If you've got this far, you're more than capable of doing it. You've already gotten through both Dive from Grace and Sanctity. You will be fine here. Now for the one where I'm expecting some disagreement, Wrath Flames. Again, I've done this without AM. It's very manageable in a coordinated group where one of the stack people can just call out who they want as their partner and if they're going mid or to the wall. And really, you could YOLO this and be totally fine. I've done that in Party Finders where people had forgotten to turn on their melons. But okay, I hear you. That's not safe, not consistent. We need a better answer. Here's my suggestion. Have the white debuff people mark themselves. You could even assign people markers to use depending on their role, but even if you don't, just having these 2 players mark themselves gives you everything you need. You can now easily see which people on Frey's side are the stacks and the nothings, so it's easy to adjust and not accidentally have people pick the wrong partners. If you want to get really fancy about it, which marker you are could also choose your priority for being mid versus on the wall. But honestly, I think this is all that's needed to make the mechanic reasonable for a random group. You don't need to mark the dark debuffs, the spreads. They're the only people on Nidhogg's side, and they know they need to not be near anyone else. So why do I think that this mechanic became such a target for the automarkers if it's this simple to resolve? Well, I think it's all about the presentation of the mechanic. You get your debuffs at the very start, while you're looking for the dive bomb to dodge and the bomb pattern, and yet it's only at the very end that they come into play, after a lot of movement where the entire group is together. There isn't the time when it matters to sort out who's going where, and when it does matter, you've just spent the past several seconds focused purely on your movement, looking at the arena, so that's where your focus is. And that's why my solution is, once again, to do something to give a visual indicator on your character to manage the mechanic. But also, it's why I think this is a flaw in the very design of the mechanic. It doesn't match up with everything else happening around it. And if the devs want to kill the melons in this encounter, that's how they should approach this problem too. In addition to the debuffs, I think that players with the debuffs during Wrath Flames should all have an aura around them matching that debuff. If we could see on our characters who has the stacks and who doesn't, we as the players could adapt to that. Would it make the mechanic easier than originally designed? A bit, but I'd argue that this difficulty has been eliminated by the community anyway at this point because of the automarkers, and honestly, the rest of this mechanic is hard enough that it's fine to tone down this one piece of it for the sake of making players less inclined to cheat. And now we arrive at top, where at current there are 4 mechanics that feature the usage of AM in Party Finder. 2 in Phase 5, which we will get to, and 2 in Phase 3. The sad thing is, we all know what the alternative is to using AM for both the intro to Phase 3 and the monitors mechanic at the end of it. Just like with Titan Jails, these are 2 more mechanics where you can replace the melons with a conga line and get the same result. Except it's worse here, because for the longest time, this was how Party Finder actually did sort out these mechanics, and that was true even as melons became commonplace for Phase 5. You line everyone up, and then because you can see in an order what everyone got, everyone knows where they need to go. With the transition, you also need to do a little more movement to identify people since the only info is in your debuff bar, but you still have more than enough time to sort it out before anything happens. It's actually the same mechanic really as Wrath Flames, but it works better here and requires melons less due to going to spots based on your debuff immediately rather than right at the end when you've had time to focus on other things that are more important. It's also another situation where if you've gotten to this mechanic, you've done more difficult things to get here. You can't AM through party synergy, at least not to my knowledge, and that is way more difficult than anything that is going on in Phase 3, aside from possibly the aiming of the monitors themselves. You don't need it, the devs did everything right, let's just go back to how things were, okay? That's harder to argue when it comes to Phase 5. For those who don't know, Phase 5 of the Omega Protocol Ultimate is centered around a buff called Quickening Dynamis. By the end of the phase, every player needs to have 3 stacks of this buff to be able to progress to the end of the encounter. This comes through 4 instances each of Hello Near World and Hello Distant World mechanics, which happen once in each trio except for the last where they happen twice. This results in our final 2 uses for automarkers. The first trio gets away without using them because nobody has any Quickening Dynamis stacks going into it, so you can instead decide who goes where entirely based on the other surrounding mechanics in that trio. Sigma does not have those same conditions. Going into Sigma, 6 players have a stack of the buff, and you want to come out of it with 4 players still having 1 stack and 4 players having 2. To do this, Party Finder groups use AM to designate who goes where in a way that will result in that outcome. The 3 players going north, one of whom will get an additional stack and the other 2 who won't, the 2 players who the jumps will originate from for this round, and the 3 remaining players who will all get an additional stack, the AM determines all. But it doesn't have to. When I was progging top with my static, it was my duty to call out who was to go north. I had a priority system based on my party list for which 3 players with 1 stack from Delta and who aren't the origin of a jump would be chosen to go north. And because of how the mechanic works, there will always be 4 to 6 options for this. All you need to do to adapt this idea for Party Finder is create a priority system based on people's roles for who goes north. Tanks, then healers, then ranged, then melee, party 1 over party 2 within the same role. That'd work just fine, or you can rearrange that however you please. But the point is, you can decide which 3 players who meet the criteria will go north based off a relatively simple priority system. And for the rest of the positioning after dividing into north and south, you can pre-position for all of it. My static did, and there's nothing about that idea that requires any additional communication that's not possible for a Party Finder group. So even Run Dynamis Sigma can be done without AM if people are willing to put in the effort. Surely the same must be true for Run Dynamis Omega, right? Well, if I'm being honest, no, it isn't. Not by the same standards anyway. Now, for the second set, you can do it entirely based on pre-positioning, and even for the first set, you can pre-position to sort out everything after the monitors are taken care of. But that's the catch. Monitors need to be taken care of, and by specific people. To be the correct person to take a monitor bait, you need to have 2 stacks of Quickening Dynamis, and you need to not be the source of the first round of Hello World jumps. There will always be at least 2 people who meet these criteria, but there can be as many as 4. And put simply, I don't think it's reasonable to ask a group to sort through the multiple priority systems at play, one for the Hello World jumps and one to decide who's baiting monitors, at the same time to resolve the mechanic. Particularly not 13 minutes into an encounter where one mistake at this stage will wipe the pull. This is the point in the encounter where I have to agree with Zeno when he said way back when the fight was first released that they fucked up with how they did this. That they put a mechanic in the game that a group of random, unorganized people would not be able to do without what he referred to as technology. Again, that's if we're applying the same standards that I have for everything else in this video. Many of you, and particularly people who've been around since ARR, have probably been wondering, why hasn't he mentioned just designating one person whose job it is to mark people for these things? These strats he keeps saying he used in statics could absolutely be replicated by one person who's able to put the markers on people manually, just like how he used to make healers mark the dive bomb spots in Coil Turn 9. And you're entirely correct. That is absolutely an option. But that's also kind of the problem. There are people out there who would see that and say, then why not just use the melons anyway if we're stacking extra responsibility on one person to do what AM does, and either way it's the exact same for the other 7 people who don't have that job. I would argue that right there is the whole reason that automarkers are so prominent to begin with. Because people can justify it as being the same as putting the responsibility on a human for 87% of the player base, and making it easier overall to boot. But it is still cheating. It is still against TOS. And clearly, a lot of people don't like that this is where we are now. For anyone saying, the problem is that people just don't understand the mechanics, I would agree up until Run Dynamis Omega. But it is actually the case in my view that with Run Dynamis Omega, Square created a mechanic that dared the player base to turn to AM, stacking priority systems on top of each other in a way that a group needs some amount of central organization to overcome. Now, if there's something that I'm missing with this one, please tell me in the comments. I want to be wrong about this. But the way I see it, this is one mechanic where just understanding how it works is not enough. And if Square wants people to move away from using third-party tools, this is a mistake they need to avoid repeating at all costs. Because I also don't have a solution for how the devs could make this doable in an unorganized group. With most of what I've mentioned, adding visual tells for the mechanics on our characters would be enough. But I don't know how you do that for the combination of having specifically 2 stacks of quickening and also not being the origin of the first jumps in this set in a way that really helps. The game doesn't just tell you who needs to grab the monitor baits, that's the whole point, that's where the challenge is. But in the end, that would be the only way to bring this mechanic back within the bounds of what's reasonable. But as long as this mechanic exists in its current state, we'll probably have to deal with all the melons that come along for the ride, no matter how little we really need them. And so, I'd like to thank everyone who made it this far for watching. Honestly, if you could just hit the like button, that would be amazing, and I would appreciate it for how it can boost this video in the algorithm. Anything beyond that, whether it be sharing this with other people, hitting that subscribe button, or using this as a basis for continuing the discussion, would be gravy, because this is a big topic in the community right now, and one that I think both the players and the dev team need to be involved in if we want to move past it. I'm Toka, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you all next time.